The current trend towards deglobalization may be the most important issue of our generation. So I thought I would research the topic, condense my findings, and head to the studio to record a short video. Well, the topic turned out to be much more interesting than I had expected, and one video turned into two, which turned into three, and I'm now trying to condense the topic into less than 5 short videos. We'll see how it goes. If you're interested in how the world works and you have a curiosity for what the future may hold, you should find this series extremely interesting. It's a very fluid environment we're living in, so the significance of some of the information may depend on the date of your viewing. In any event, I hope you find it both insightful and helpful. I'm Rick Alvarado. Let's get started. The growing threat from China and Russia's war in Ukraine are shaking up the international order at levels we haven't seen since World War II. The fracturing of our relationship with both China and Russia at the same time is not just a national security threat, it's also an economic problem. In fact, some are describing it as the beginning of the end of globalization. At the very least, I think it's safe to say that the days of relatively unfettered international trade, well, they're probably behind us. One thing is certain, the rules for asset allocation will be very different going forward than they were looking back. And any degree of unwinding the interdependence of global trade will be a messy and expensive proposition. One that could drive inflation to very uncomfortable levels as we untangle an extraordinarily complicated web of international trade and rebuild our industrial capacity at home. I'm going to discuss the history of globalization and what to expect from the process of deglobalization. It's a good news, bad news story that I'll present as a review of the past with an explanation of the present and a guide to the future. But first, let's create some context for why the topic is so timely and so important for investors. As the old saying goes, when in doubt, zoom out. So let's start with a review of the basics. I think we can all agree that one of the primary purposes for investing is to grow assets, not just for the purpose of increasing wealth, but also to provide protection from the impact of inflation. Well, despite the Fed's recent success at reducing inflation, which is what happens when you crush demand with interest rates, there is a gathering storm of evidence suggesting that inflation could rebound and persist well beyond this year or next. That's not good news if you're planning or currently in retirement, especially if you're hoping to ratchet down investments to a more conservative posture. And that leaves investors at a crossroads. Invest conservatively and risk exposure to inflation, or maintain a more resolute posture and face inflation head first. Borrowing some wisdom from Rush, the rock band, not the radio host, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. The point is, failing to address inflation has precisely the same impact as a decision that it poses no risk. But what if it results in a negative outcome? Had you been informed of the risk and presented with steps to address it, might you have chosen a different route? It's an important point, one that I hope to address with this video. All right, now, despite the almost universally accepted maxim that investments are best held for the long term, most investment research has a relatively short shelf life. In other words, it's probably best to rely on data that looks a little further down the road than this month's inflation numbers. Don't get me wrong, forecasting the future is helpful, and addressing inflation risk is critical, but a little context goes a long way. Sometimes a view of the future is made a little clearer with a better understanding of the past. Fortunately, you don't need a history degree to recognize that we're in the midst of some major shifts in the geopolitical landscape, and a lot of these mega trends point to an unraveling of the last 75 years of globalization. Some of the trends have been obvious since the 1960s, but because they occur at a glacial speed, they've been very easy to ignore. Well, we're now feeling the impact of those trends, so ignoring them may no longer be an option. Now, in order to keep the topic easier to digest, I think it's helpful to break it down into 4 parts. First, I'll review the history of globalization. Because the degree of interconnectedness we all associate with globalization has only been around since the end of World War II. So in the context of human existence, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And given that it's the only experience for virtually everyone on the planet, the history gets lost. Second, I'll go over how the world's aging demographic after World War II is having a massive impact on industrialized economies all over the world. Demographics play a major role in determining both the cost of labor and the level of consumer demand, meaning they contribute to whether or not products and services are expensive or cheap, and they determine whether there is sufficient demand for economic growth. Those variables undergird the foundation for a strong economy, and it's what helped coin the phrase, demographics is destiny. Third, I'm going to make the case for why deglobalization could drive inflation higher, possibly much higher, and much longer than many people expect. But making the case for a prolonged bout with inflation requires an appreciation for how profoundly dependent the world has become on international trade, and how deglobalization could impact a lot more than just what we pay at the pump or the grocery store. People seem to find this topic the most interesting, in part because we've all grown up in a world in which we've taken globalization for granted. And we now find ourselves in the position of having to reflect not just on how good it's been, but also how dependent we've become, and most important, how fragile it is. This is the topic that provides insight into the realm of geopolitics, and I'm finding it to be an epiphany for most people. And finally, I'll discuss what to do about it, because if higher than expected inflation becomes a reality for the next 3, 5, or 7 years, then failing to address it could derail an otherwise thoughtful retirement plan. And if globalization unwinds, even partially, then asset allocation models will need to be adjusted. Here's the thing, all breakups are messy, but the unwinding of globalization is just something for which there is no precedent. And it could leave investors grossly unprepared to deal with the process. And it will be a process. But it isn't necessarily all gloom and doom. A shift in the global order can create opportunities if you keep your feet firmly planted, an ear to the ground, and an eye on the future. In the final video of the series, I'll have an outline for doing just that. But in order to appreciate the argument for deglobalization, let's first set the stage with some history.